The first log she split that summer came down with a scream. It wasn't from her, though every part of her body ached like it wanted to cry out. It was from the neighbors, a pair of them, on horseback, who'd happened to ride by just as she raised the axe. One of them cackled so hard he almost dropped his reins. "God above, she's stacking wood already. She'll have a furnace in her attic next," the other added, spitting tobacco into the dust. Annie Coyle ignored them. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch when they slowed to gawk, didn't offer a smile or a word, just raised the axe again and split another log clean down the middle, then another. The woodpile beside her house wasn't on the ground. It was on her roof, more specifically, just beneath it. To most, it looked like her roof had been built too thick, a miscalculation. Heavy planks stacked at awkward angles, extra-wide beams layered under the shingles. But it wasn't a mistake. Annie had designed it that way on purpose. The entire upper structure of her little cabin was a firewood vault, hidden in plain sight, and she was filling it, one log at a time, while the valley laughed. They'd laughed when she first returned. They'd whispered the word widow before her boots hit the dirt at the general store. They watched her bring 2 oxen and a wagon of salvaged planks to a patch of river-fed land that every other settler had turned down for being too soft and soggy. They scoffed when she started building up instead of out, when she worked alone, when she hammered through dusk and into the black. But the moment they saw her stack cords of firewood into her roof, that's when the real mockery began. Firewood belongs in a shed, woman. She gonna cook her roof or what? Wait till the snow cracks that whole ceiling down on her fool head." Annie said nothing, but every swing of her axe seemed to speak, and she wasn't done yet. It had been 9 months since she buried her husband in Missouri soil, 6 months since the landlord gave her 2 weeks to clear out with her child, 4 months since she traded her last jewelry for mule feed and a forged map to somewhere that promised soft winters and open land. That map was a lie. The winters here were hard as stone, and the people colder. Her nearest neighbor, Tom Baxter, hadn't said a kind word since she arrived. "You're gonna need a man come November," he'd said once, standing at the edge of her property with a smirk like he thought he was offering help. "I'll be fine," she said, without looking at him. "No one makes it alone out here." "I'm not no one." She was right, but no one cared. By August, the hills were gold and the river ran thin. Every settler was cutting wood. Every yard had a fresh shed. The men built theirs tall, dry, wide. Big doors, slanted roofs, plenty of space to stack the cords. They chopped in pairs and hooted and laughed while they worked. And when they passed Annie's place, they always had something to say. "Gonna cook up there? You trying to kill that kid of yours with chimney fumes? She thinks snow don't melt on a rooftop." And still, Annie split, stacked, measured, lifted. She had built a secret door into the loft and fitted it with narrow shelves like drawers. Each shelf was lined with cured bark-peeled oak and hickory, tightly packed to insulate the space, keep the heat in and the moisture out. But even that wasn't her real trick. Under the loft floor, in the gap between ceiling joists, she'd run thin copper pipe, leftover scrap from an abandoned mine site. She buried the pipe in clay and sand and looped it close to the chimney flue so it would warm gently. Then she bricked over the flue near the loft ceiling, forcing the smoke and heat to pass through the length of her little firewood chamber before escaping through the upper chimney. It wasn't just storage, it was warm storage. That first frost came fast. September snapped down with an edge that caught even the old-timers by surprise. Gardens failed overnight. The general store sold out of wool and salt in 2 days. Men scrambled to tarp their woodpiles. Annie watched from her steps, her son James tugging at her sleeve. "Are we going to freeze?" She looked at the sky, smelled the smoke already rising from half the homes in the valley. "No," she said, brushing the dirt from her hands. "We're going to be just fine." Tom Baxter's shed collapsed in the 3rd week of October. The storm was heavy and wet, rain that turned to sleet and stuck like a curse. His roof hadn't been pitched enough. The walls swelled and warped. By morning, his entire cordwood stack was buried under a mix of slush and pine needles. A week later, mold crept through the bark like ink through paper. He came stomping up Annie's path the day after. "You seen what happened?" he barked, soaked and red-faced. Annie nodded. "I heard. You got any dry wood to spare?" She didn't answer right away. James stood behind her in the doorway, silent, one thumb in his mouth. "I got what we need," Annie said carefully, "but not much more." Tom sniffed and glanced at the roof. "You still got it up there?" She didn't nod, didn't deny it either. "Fool thing to do," he grunted. "Bet it's soaked through by now." Annie said nothing. He spat again and left. By November, 2 more sheds had failed, one from rot, the other from mice. The storm season wasn't slowing. Every week brought more rain. Snow crept down from the ridgelines early, and wind began tearing at anything not bolted tight. Folks doubled up their fires, chopped more, began eyeing each other's piles with unease. But Annie's roof didn't smoke, not yet. Is she even using wood? Folks asked. Or just hoarding it? Maybe it's all gone to mold by now. Maybe she burned it already and just wants us to think she's still got it. But Annie wasn't burning. Not yet. Inside her cabin, the walls were warm to the touch. The hidden flue chamber kept heat circulating through the upper floor, drying the wood and insulating the whole structure. She'd sealed her roof tight with tar-soaked cloth and built her shingles to overhang just enough to divert the worst of the melt. No snow touched her stack, no rot crept in. The wood stayed dry and warmed gently by the same fires that cooked their meals and dried their socks. James didn't ask about freezing again. He just played in the warm patch beside the chimney every night. Then came the blizzard, a real one. It hit in the middle of December. No warning, no mercy. 3 feet of snow in one night. Whole barns vanished. Trees snapped like bones. Chimneys caved in from wet weight. One man froze trying to reach his shed through a drift. Another tried to light damp wood and nearly gassed his family with smoke. Annie lit her stove just once that day, a single fire. The warmth from that blaze lingered for 12 hours. She pulled a shelf of wood from the loft just before bed, dry, fragrant, perfectly preserved, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she slept without worry. In the days that followed, her neighbors came stumbling up one by one. Some tried to mask it as curiosity. Heard you had a roof trick, Annie. Others were direct. We need dry wood. Ours is gone. Please. Annie opened the door only halfway. What happened to all the laughter? She asked. Not cruel, just tired. They had no answer. And when Tom Baxter returned, hat in hand, frostbitten across one cheek, he didn't smirk. I got a wife sick in bed, he said. Kids are coughing. I got nothing dry left. Annie looked past him to the trees, to the drifts. Then she stepped aside. You can take some, she said, but only enough to start. Tom blinked. Start what? She stared. Start building something smarter. The storm didn't end with that one blizzard. It never did in this valley. Not when the clouds stacked low like bricks for weeks. Not when the wind hissed like it was crawling under your skin. Not when the snow, once a fluffy blanket, turned hard and brittle, cracking like dry bark under your boots. Every day after that storm was just a variation of the same punishment, colder, wetter, or crueler. And Annie's cabin, with its slanted wooden roof packed with secret firewood, began to stand out for what it was. Not a curiosity, not a mistake, a fortress. But that didn't mean things got easier. Because when people get desperate and cold and hungry, they don't just ask, they take. It started small, a set of footprints circling the cabin at night. Annie saw them when she stepped outside at dawn to empty the ash bucket. James pointed them out. They don't go anywhere, he said. They just go round and round. He was right. The prints never approached the door, just circled the house once. No knock, no shout, no call for help. Annie stared at them for a long time. Then she carried James back inside and barred the door. That night, she slept with the axe near the hearth. The next night, she didn't sleep at all. By the 3rd week of that brutal freeze, Annie's roof stack had become the most talked about thing in the valley. Must be near 20 cords up there. I bet it's warm as spring inside. She don't even burn that much. She's sitting on half the valley's worth. She got no man, no dog, no gun. What's stopping us? That last one wasn't said to her face, but she felt it. You can feel when someone starts to see your comfort as theft, as if the extra warmth in your walls is something you owe to others, just for surviving smarter. James asked, Are people mad at us? She tried to soften the answer. They're cold, but we're not, he whispered. No sun, she said, holding him close. We're not. The first man who tried was drunk, or stupid, maybe both. It was 2 hours past sunset when the sound came, crack, followed by a sliding shuffle. Not at the front door, above. Annie froze. She'd been kneeling by the fire, adjusting the damper. The kettle whistled soft. James was dozing, curled under a thick buffalo blanket. Another creak on the roof. She moved fast, silent, like the sound itself had pulled her bones tight. She grabbed the iron poker, not the axe. It was closer. She opened the loft hatch with care and climbed up into the rafters without a sound. The attic was dark, cold, but not freezing, not with the flue heat running underneath. A shape moved at the far end of the ceiling, just where the narrow access hatch led outside. He was trying to pry it open. She didn't yell, didn't wait. She jammed the iron poker into the hatch latch from the inside and slammed the beam down with all her weight. Crack, a yelp, then a thud, then silence. She waited. The wood above groaned, then scraped, then fell still. He didn't try again. She found blood on the snow the next morning. Not much, but enough to confirm he'd gotten hurt. She didn't ask who it was, didn't walk into town, didn't open her door when someone knocked gently 3 days later and said, There's been an accident. Anyone come by here lately? She just shook her head. Nobody pressed further. They were too busy freezing. The valley had turned mean by January. The wet storm early in the season had poisoned most of the wood. Even the ones who'd tarped their stacks found mold crawling up from the ground. The sheds had warped. Doors froze shut. Even roofs collapsed from the weight of ice that never melted, only grew. Families burned furniture, old fence posts, even barn siding. And they got sick. Oh, they got sick. Smoke thickened the air for miles. You could smell it in the wind, wet bark and desperation. Children coughed in every house. Mothers spooned water into lips cracked and blistered. Men stared at empty hearths, holding useless logs like they could will them dry. And in the middle of it all, Annie's roof, untouched, untarnished, unrotted. They stopped laughing, but now they started knocking. It was Eliza McReynolds first, the merchant's wife. No hat, thin gloves, eyes hollow. "We lost our firewood, all of it," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Tom said you had a little to spare." Annie let her in, gave her 3 armfuls, enough for a couple days if they burned low. "I'll trade you," Eliza said, fumbling with a brooch. "No. Please, save it, you'll need it." Eliza wept when she left. Next came the schoolteacher, then the old trapper, then the mother with 3 young boys whose faces were so red with cold they looked bruised. Annie gave each what she could, but her supply wasn't endless. Even with careful rations, it was dwindling. She didn't regret sharing, but she could feel the line approaching, a line she'd have to draw in the ice. And it came, not with a knock, but a boot. They tried to kick in the door, 3 of them, men she barely knew, faces half covered in scarves and frost and cowardice. They didn't ask, didn't plead. They came at night, shoulder to wood, yelling something about stockpiles. And everybody's got to share now. Annie was waiting. She'd reinforced the door with an iron bar weeks earlier, but that wasn't her only trick. When the first crack sounded, she lit the chimney flue to full, feeding it with bark scraps and dry kindling. Then she pushed a coal pan up into the loft, set beneath a vented shelf of pine needles. Smoke poured out the gaps like hell had opened. The men shouted. One gagged, one ran. The third tried again, then slipped on the ice she'd thrown across the porch. She didn't chase, didn't have to. Word got around by morning. "Widow Coyle's got booby traps. She's got poison gas. She's got no soul." But no one tried again. Not like that. By the end of January, most families had run out of usable firewood. Some abandoned their cabins and tried to huddle in the church house. Others dug into caves. One family tried to burn peat moss and nearly choked themselves to death. And Annie's roof still held. It was nearly empty now, only a few racks left. But the wood was still dry, still warm from the constant, slow-circulating heat. Every piece she pulled down burned fast, hot and clean. She could boil water in minutes, dry socks in hours, keep James asleep through the howling nights. And still, the valley glared. Then came the worst night of all, the true freeze. Temperatures dropped so far that even frost turned brittle. Snow stopped falling. It was too cold to snow. The air went dead. Even the birds vanished. Pipes cracked. Chickens froze upright. A dog howled once. Then never again. The whole valley groaned like it was being crushed. That night, Annie didn't sleep. She lay beside James in the loft, listening to the silence, the weight of it pressing against the cabin walls. Then a knock, not a pounding, not shouting, just a soft knock. Again and again. She got up, slow, moved to the door, rested her hand on the latch. The voice was thin, scared. "Mom, please." She opened it an inch. It was a girl, couldn't be more than 16. Holding her baby brother wrapped in grain sacks, no gloves. Her lips were cracked white. Her teeth chattered so violently she couldn't finish her sentence. Annie opened the door wide, said nothing, just pulled her in. By dawn, the girl had recovered enough to talk. The rest of her family hadn't made it. Her father had tried to dig a trench shelter. It flooded. Froze, crushed. Annie gave her broth, let her sleep, wrapped the baby tight in wool. The last shelf of firewood was nearly gone now. But she wasn't cold, not yet. By February, it wasn't a question of who needed firewood. It was a question of who would live long enough to ask. The freeze hadn't broken. If anything, it had deepened. Days blurred into each other like frost-bitten shadows, and what little daylight came was dull and pale. No warmth touched the valley. Trees stopped creaking. Streams froze solid. The sound of an axe ringing in the distance, a familiar winter rhythm, had vanished altogether. No one had dry wood left, except Annie, and she was down to her last 20 logs. James noticed first. "Mama, the pile's almost gone." He said it with curiosity, not fear. He still trusted that she had a plan. She always had a plan. Annie didn't answer right away. She looked at the shelf above the hearth, where the last few carefully stacked pieces of seasoned hickory rested like sacred relics. "I know, sweetheart. We're not going to freeze, though." "No." she said softly. Not us. But she didn't say more, because it wasn't just about them anymore. The girl and her baby brother were still with her. She'd told Annie her name now, Martha, 17. Her baby brother's name was Caleb. He hadn't cried since the night they arrived, too weak for it. Martha helped where she could, melting snow, sweeping the ash, tending to James while Annie chopped kindling. But Annie could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked toward the hearth, the hunger in her face when she stared at the woodpile. The question was coming, the same question everyone had asked. Do you have more? The valley began to turn in on itself. Someone broke into the abandoned blacksmith's house, tore apart the walls for timber. Two brothers fought over the last slab of dried meat in the general store. One nearly bled out on the floor. The schoolteacher froze in her own bed, alone. No one found her for 2 days. There was no community anymore, just cabins, just hunger, just fireless chimneys and rumors like smoke. And the rumors, they started changing. She's still warm in there. She's feeding strangers now. She's got wood hidden no one's seen. And eventually, she's hoarding. That word carried sharpness like a knife. Annie heard it whispered at the creek once, when she dared leave the cabin for water. She had that whole roof full, remember? Bet she's got more under the floor. Bet she's sitting on it while the rest of us die. And so the danger changed shape. No longer thieves in the night. Now righteous men, the kind who think they're owed something. Annie boarded up the lower windows, not carelessly, quietly, behind curtains, so no one would see the light vanish and guess she was still there. She put ash over the chimney to kill the smoke trail. She rationed the last logs with frightening precision. No more full burns, just smoldering coals to heat clay pots and keep the cabin from freezing solid. James didn't like the dark. Martha didn't like the silence, but they understood. We're hiding? James asked once. No, Annie whispered. We're surviving. And then came the day of fire. She smelled it first. Wood smoke, thick and bitter, but not from her own hearth. She stepped onto the porch at dawn and saw the glow, a red halo above the trees to the west. Someone's cabin was burning. She didn't know whose, couldn't tell if it was accident or rage. But by noon, the valley knew. Eliza McReynolds had died. Her husband had tried to burn wet wood, soaked in kerosene. A wall caught, then the roof. She never made it out. And just like that, the guilt turned to fury. Not at the man who spilled the kerosene, at Annie. She had wood, someone shouted at the store. She had enough to help more people. She let a woman die. They came that night, not sneaking, marching. 5 men, lanterns in hand, and a 6th, dragging a sled with an axe and a crowbar strapped to it. Martha saw them first from the loft. She hissed Annie's name and pointed with shaking hands. James woke up crying before they even reached the porch. Annie didn't speak. She didn't grab the axe. She didn't run. She opened the trapdoor beneath the rug. It had been dug months ago, a crawl space barely wide enough for 3 people, packed tight with wool and sawdust, hidden under boards that blended into the floor. She hadn't used it before. Now she shoved Martha and James inside. Then she climbed in herself and closed the hatch. The first crash was the door. They didn't knock, just smashed it open. Boots stomped in. A man's voice growled, "She's gone!" Another, "No, she's hiding!" Then came the crowbar. Thuds, grunts, furniture dragged. The table flipped, a shelf smashed. "Check the loft!" Annie held James against her chest. His breath came in tiny gasps. Martha held Caleb like a stone. Above them, the boots stomped. Then the sound of hands slapping the walls. Nothing. Then silence. And then something worse. The sound of splitting wood. Chop, chop, chop. They were in the loft now, ripping apart the roof. Annie knew what they'd find. Almost nothing. Just a handful of half-burned scraps. She'd moved the last dry logs into the crawl space days ago. The roof was empty now, just the skeleton of what once had kept them warm. She listened as they realized it. Oh, she's got nothing. She burned it all. Lied to us. Let us suffer. And then came the crash of a lantern, the hiss of oil, the spark. Someone cursed. Someone shouted, "You fool!" Flames. Annie smelled them first, then felt them. The heat spread fast. Smoke filled the space above the crawl room like a lid on a kettle. James whimpered. Martha started to choke. Annie threw open the hatch and climbed out into firelight. The cabin was lit orange and gold, the walls burning, the roof roaring. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She ran for the water barrel, or dumped it over the hatch, shoved the children back inside, and slammed it shut behind them. She didn't expect to live. Not really. Not with her cabin roaring like a bonfire in the wind. But the snow saved her. She collapsed in it, half-burned coat hissing as it hit the crust. She crawled, blind, gasping, until the cold swallowed the heat clinging to her face. She passed out with her hand frozen around the axe handle and woke to silence. The fire didn't spread. The snow saw to that. What it didn't stop, though, was the damage. Her roof was gone. Her loft, her shelves, her clever flue, all gone. But the trapdoor still stood. She pulled it open at dawn, frost-bitten fingers shaking. 3 sets of eyes blinked up at her from the smoke-black crawl space. Alive. They had no more firewood. But she had the one thing no one else did. A crawl space full of warmth, not logs, bricks, heavy stones heated by the last of her stash, wrapped in wool, still radiating warmth even days later, enough to keep them alive, enough to start again. The town came in pieces after that, not to loot, not to gloat, but to apologize. The men who'd burned her cabin never came forward, but folks knew. They helped rebuild, quietly, no more mockery, no more whispers. And when the snows melted and the valley opened up again, one thing stood above all else: a new cabin with a thick roof, and below that roof a secret space. Not just one, but many. Because now the others began to copy her. Too late for some, just in time for others. The valley thawed slow. The freeze didn't just vanish with a sunny morning. It retreated inch by inch, grudging, like it had to be pried loose from the land. Annie watched it happen from the edge of her burned-out cabin, wrapped in patched wool and silence. Patches of dirt peeked through the snow like bruises healing. Water began to trickle again in the creek. Chickens that had vanished reappeared from the brush, dazed, pecking cautiously at the soil. People began to talk again. And Annie Coyle, she didn't say much, not for a while. They'd brought her lumber, quietly, left it stacked beside her ruins without a word. Planks, nails, tarps, rope. It wasn't charity. It was penance. She didn't ask where it came from. She didn't care. She accepted it, and she began to build. Martha stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was true, but because she wanted to stay. She cooked, she hauled water, she took care of Caleb like he was her own. Annie didn't ask if she planned to leave when spring came. She didn't need to. They were kin now, not by blood, but by fire. Same with the others. The ones who had nearly taken everything from her now stood beside her, hammering frames and laying beams. Tom Baxter came every morning. He never apologized outright, but he never left without finishing a task. That was enough. James didn't understand all of it, not fully. He watched the grown-ups work with wide, serious eyes. He tried to help, but was usually sent off to collect pebbles or keep Caleb from eating dirt. One day he asked, "Mama, are we building the same house?" Annie looked at the frame, now taller than her head, with its reinforced supports and double-thick ceiling beams. "No," she said, "we're building something better." They weren't the only ones rebuilding. Cabins across the valley were in ruin, some from rot, others from desperation-fueled damage, and a few still scorched black where fires had been set accidentally. The town was quiet with shame. No one said much aloud, but there was a shared look among the people now, a kind of reckoning. The widow who once stacked wood in her roof was no longer a joke. She was a reference, a blueprint, a quiet reminder of what had been ignored, and then copied. The first man to do it openly was Peter Handley. He walked up to Annie one afternoon with a hat full of nails and eyes full of humility. "Do you mind if I ask how you did the flue vent under the roof?" he said. "I can't make sense of how it ran without smoking the whole place out." Annie didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "Come tomorrow. I'll show you what I'm doing this time." It became a strange sort of ritual. Every week someone new came to learn how to insulate logs from melt, how to vent heat upward through stone and clay, how to hide warmth in places people wouldn't think to look. They weren't just building houses, they were building memory. Memory of what had been lost and what had saved them. Still, not everyone came. There were holdouts, men who still wouldn't look her in the eye, women who whispered behind hands when Annie passed, some who blamed her for what she'd been forced to do, for surviving smarter than they had, but she didn't carry bitterness. She carried lessons, and she passed them on to the ones who wanted them, especially the children. Spring came with floods. The frozen earth couldn't drink fast enough, and rivers swelled. Sheds crumbled under the weight of what hadn't been touched in months. Mold exploded in cellars. Entire fence lines sloughed off into the mud. But Annie's new cabin stood, tall, raised, solid. The roof was double-pitched now, with an insulated core designed not just for storage, but for heat retention. Between the outer shingles and the inner rafters, she'd laid a bed of clay-lined tin channels that could catch radiant warmth from the stove below and circulate it upward to the loft. It was even better than the last one. James called it the warm hat, and it worked. In late March, another knock came at her door. This one was different, gentler, familiar. Annie opened it and found Eliza McReynolds' eldest daughter, Nora, 18, thin, pale, but standing. "I heard what you did," she said. "How you helped folks, even after what they did to you." Annie said nothing. Nora looked down, hands clenched. "I don't have much, but I've got strong hands. I can help build, or plant, Or take care of the little ones. Annie stepped aside. Then come in. That spring, Annie's cabin wasn't the only one with a raised roof. 4 others in the valley followed her model. Some mimicked it exactly, others adapted it. One man built a pulley system to raise and lower firewood racks into his loft. Another installed stone-lined ducts to channel flue heat around his entire upper wall frame. People laughed less now. They listened. The general store began stocking better tar. The blacksmith started casting chimney caps designed to help retain radiant heat. Someone imported bags of lime for better mortar. The whole valley changed. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but enough. Enough to prove that what Annie had built wasn't just a trick, it was a culture shift. Summer came, brief and muddy. Children ran barefoot again. The fields took longer to green, but they came back, and for the first time in a long while, Annie felt something return to her that had been lost for years. Hope. And yet, even in the warmth of July, she was preparing. She taught James how to test wood for dryness. She showed Martha how to seal a flue joint with clay and ash. She let Caleb watch as she laid down the first stack of firewood into the loft of the new roof. Carefully arranged, labeled by season, tucked behind hidden hatches, and layered with straw against any dampness. We still need to be ready, she said, because this valley forgets fast. Martha nodded, but we don't. Then came a knock one late summer afternoon that wasn't seeking help or trade. It was the preacher. He held his hat in his hands, eyes soft with apology. I never did thank you, he said, for taking in Martha, for what you did with the firewood, for surviving. Annie didn't answer. He stepped forward, fumbled with his coat. We'd like you to speak at the town gathering. A lesson for next winter. Teach us all, properly. Annie stared past him to the ridge, where the last patch of snow still clung in shadow, where the ghosts of laughter still echoed on the wind. I don't want to talk, she said, but I'll show you. By late August, the new town hall was half finished. It was the first building in the valley not made entirely of wood. The walls were log-framed, yes, but filled between with packed clay and straw, and the roof. It followed Annie's design. Wide rafters, hollow beams, heat flue running beneath a raised ridge. It wasn't just a place for meetings anymore. It was a shelter. They built it that way because nobody wanted to live through that winter again. And if they did, no one wanted to do it the old way. They didn't say Annie's name when they planned the roof. They didn't need to. The first cold wind came in mid-September. Not much. A dry gust across the high ridge, enough to remind the children what frostbite felt like. James pointed to the sky. It's coming early again, Annie nodded. It always comes early if you're not ready. But they were ready. This time, they were ready. She had laid up 10 cords before the frost hit, 5 in the roof, 2 under the floor, 1 in the crawl space, and the rest tucked in sealed bins in the back wall. New construction, vented to pull warmth off the stove's outer brick and keep the logs dry. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a machine for living through storms. Tom Baxter brought a barrel of apples one day. Don't have much left that ain't been wormed, he said, but these are good, early. Sweet. He lingered by the porch, hat in hand. You were right about the wood, the roof. I should have seen it back then. Annie didn't answer. He cleared his throat. I've built mine like yours now. Not exact, still got my own way, but heat runs up through the loft. My youngest says it's warm enough to sleep up there without a blanket. He paused. My wife says thank you. Annie took the apples, nodded once. Others came too, not for lessons, but to show what they'd learned. The O'Hara boys had built a second-floor stove alcove with stone insulation packed tight to keep warmth overnight. Martha, now 18 and carrying Caleb on her hip like he was hers, had drawn her own sketch for a future bunkhouse. 2 chimneys, shared heat, roof-stacked firewood in steel-lined trays that could be slid inside during storms. They weren't copying Annie anymore. They were building on her foundation, and she watched them with something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Pride. The day before the first snow hit, she found James behind the cabin, stacking kindling in precise rows. Why not just toss it in the box? She asked. He looked up, serious. Because it'll get damp, and we might need it fast. Annie smiled. That's right. That night the wind rose again, hard, a howl that reminded the valley of what it had survived. But this time chimneys smoked thick and clean. Roofs held. No one ran through the snow begging for firewood. The sheds stayed dry, the children stayed warm, and deep beneath her floor the hidden bricks glowed with stored heat. Martha wrapped Caleb in wool and rocked him in the corner. James slept upstairs, dreaming. Annie sat by the window, staring out into the night, watching snow fall like feathers. She didn't feel smug. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt safe. For the first time in years, the storm outside wasn't a threat. It was just weather, and her home wasn't a hiding place. It was proof. Proof that a widow with no help but her own 2 hands and a little foresight could do more than survive. She could lead, even if no one said it out loud. In the spring, the town officially adopted new building codes. They didn't call them Annie's laws, but every rule about roof storage, elevated firewood racks, and passive flue heat came from her blueprints. They didn't laugh anymore. They built better because of her.